we all as Americans and even many political scientists have the idea that most Americans vote based on economic issues. Most Americans actually vote on another basis, usually on ethnicity or race, or religion or region of the country they live in, and to some extent in the last 20 to 30 years based on education level, sex, and age.
Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical Innertube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Robert Speel is an associate professor and program chair of political science at Penn State Behrend, which is located in Erie, Pennsylvania. He researches many aspects of American politics, including elections and voting behavior, state and urban politics, Congress and the presidency, public policy, as well as ethnic and racial politics, and even Canadian politics. That sort of covers everything. He's got the whole thing done. He's written a book called Changing Patterns of Voting in the Northern United States. It's about the creation of the regional divide of red states and blue states in the United States. And he's here today to help us discover how we got where we are today in politics here in the good old USA. Robert, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Terrific.
One of the things that has occurred to John and I over the years as we've talked to various people attached with politics is how things seem to be upending in the political world. I don't think maybe even 15 or 20 years ago, if you had told somebody that Republicans are going to be for the common man and Democrats would be standing for the elite, that they would laugh you out of the room. That it seems to have twisted around, even in my lifetime, in John's lifetime, to a point where Democrats used to be the working man's party and Republicans were the party of the penthouse. That seems to have changed. Do you agree with that? And if so, why did we get on that path?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I teach a class about American political campaigns and elections at Penn State. And what I like to teach the students, and I show them a chart, in the 1950s, there was a direct correlation between educational level and voting Republican. So the more years of education, formal education that you had, the more likely you were to vote Republican. Today, it's the opposite. Especially among white voters, the more years of education you have, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. And the strongest base for the Republican Party are white voters who did not have education beyond high school. You're also seeing some changes in that direction among non-white voters, especially in this past election last year. What I do is I'd like to teach students there were 5 issues in the 1960s that I think kind of broke apart the old party coalitions that we think of as, working class people vote Democrat and wealthy people vote Republican. And I can get into that in a few minutes, but let me give you both a chance to make a comment or ask another question here.
Okay, I'd love to ask a question. I mean, sitting here, I recall only in 2000, from 2000 about 2008, when the administration was administration of foreign policy backed by military might, that we went out and we strung up the bad guys and rebuilt broken countries. And basically and we knew what we were doing as far as that, but we projected American military might. And now it seems as though we're rushing toward a kind of protectionism and isolationism, which hasn't been seen since the 20s. In fact, a lot of what the playbook seems to be hasn't been seen since the 20s, if you ask me. But you can tell me if I'm wrong. But this does seem to have overtones of Coolidge, overtones of even McKinley. It just seems as though that whole thing has switched utterly. Whereas it used to be, we're the guys who can project might. We can go to other countries. We can intervene in history to let's be done with all that. Not even treaties. We'll make war by tariffs.
Yeah, and well, Trump, our current president, Donald Trump, seems to be an admirer of William McKinley, as you're probably aware. I mean, he just renamed the highest point in the United States, the highest mountain in the United States, in Alaska, which was named for McKinley for no good reason, and had been renamed to Mount Denali under President Obama, and Trump has renamed it as Mount McKinley, which has upset people in Alaska. And McKinley is known for his high tariff policy, which helped him win the 1896 presidential election. And he's known for basically starting the era of U.S. imperialism, where, the Spanish-American War, where the United States took over Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines for a long time. And also he annexed Hawaii after the monarch there had been overthrown. We do seem to be going back to some extent. The current president seems to like that part of history. He's been talking about how he liked the high tariff age of the late 1800s, when the United States used to impose high taxes on imports, and he thought that benefited the economy. It also led to the era that we know as the Gilded Age today. That may have worked in the 1880s and 1890s when we didn't have airplanes yet, and when ships had to have dangerous crossings across the Atlantic when they might hit icebergs and things like that. I'm not sure that's a good way to govern or run the world economy in the year 2025. And obviously, back then, countries that had a lot of military might would just go and take over any other country they like to. And the European powers splitting up Africa. But in the 21st century, that's with the United Nations, that's generally considered inappropriate in an act of war and gets people quite angry. So.
I was listening to an interview recently with the editor of The Economist, that magazine out of London that talks about economies, basically. And she said something along the lines of, President Trump has talked about a golden age, but every time I hear him, it's Gilded Age.
Yeah.
Because she has that same opinion you do, that a lot of the Trump policies are twisting us back to where we used to be and not looking forward to where we want to be.
Yeah, and I think that's a common theme with Donald Trump. I mean, a lot of his economic policies seem to be from the 1890s. A lot of his social policies and the way he viewed society seems to be from when he was a young man in the 1960s. I mean, he still imagines some of the crime and disorder of the streets that we had in this country in the 1960s rather than the way things are now. So, I mean, how his own mind works, I can't, interpret that. But there does seem to be an attitude, at least on his part, of going back to some times that he thinks, make America great again. That's his slogan.
Right.
I'm not sure if voters felt that way before he became active in politics, but now that he's become the leader of the Republican Party, you find a lot of his supporters who will express those same attitudes, probably without thinking about them too deeply.
So is this now, I'm not asking this as a member of any party, right? I'm sort of like Groucho Marx. I don't want to belong to any party that would have me as a member. But having said that, I'm wondering, there are a lot of people who seem to be signing on to policies that they were bad-mouthing, seems like 20 minutes ago. Now, is this all bandwagoning? Is this just seeing that, we can win this way or we can stay in power this way, so let's just all do it no matter what it is? Or is there something else behind it?
I guess, personally, I would say this is all bandwagoning. I'm not sure. I mean, I do know a lot of the people who support Trump have always been kind of isolationists in foreign policy. So in that sense, Trump hit in an attitude or an emotion among many conservative voters that they've always felt. They kind of went along with the Bush era of foreign policy, where the United States used its military might and formed alliances and got involved in conflicts around the world. But a lot of more conservative voters, particularly a lot of voters who never got university degrees, have always felt the United States should focus on issues back in the United States and not get involved in world affairs. And there's always been a strong attitude like that among conservative voters who tend to vote Republican. So Trump is probably saying things that a lot of conservative voters think as far as that goes. But I mean, a lot of it, as far as the congressional leaders, the Republican leaders in Congress who just 10 and 20 years ago were talking about how wonderful the Iraq war was and how we have to get involved and stop radical Islamists from taking over more territory and preventing terrorism. Some of it is just bandwagonish. I mean, they're just, this is what seems to be popular at the moment. Trump is popular among their party base, and they're just going along with it.
So I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question. And that is is this movement away from getting involved abroad? Is this because of what happened in Iraq?
There's always been, you teach students there were different lessons drawn from World War I and World War II in the 20th century. So the lesson the United States drew from World War I is we shouldn't have gotten involved. It wasn't our conflict. Many Americans died, and the United States should stay out of world affairs and let other countries deal with their own problems. And that was the lesson a lot of Americans drew from World War I, which led to the isolation of the 1920s. And then that isolationism, many political scientists would argue, led to the conditions that became World War II, because the United States was staying out of the League of Nations. The United States was staying out of world affairs, and that allowed a country like Germany eventually to run amok in Europe and kill millions of people in the process. So the lesson many American leaders got from World War II was the United States must be involved in world affairs to prevent things like that from happening again. And there was a bipartisan consensus for decades after World War II that the United States needs to be involved. That begins to fall apart after the Vietnam War, when many liberals and Democrats decided, well, no, we don't want to be involved in policing the rest of the world. And then to some extent for Republicans, that kind of does happen after the Iraq War. But there's still, within the conservative movement, there still was an attitude left over probably from the 1920s, from 100 years ago, of many conservatives who felt the United States should focus on the problems of Americans and not get involved with other countries, without perhaps fully realizing that the problems of other countries eventually reach the United States if we're not involved in the rest of the world. So my long answer to your question, John, is probably partly, but that would not be the full reason why.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're talking about 5 points. Let's launch into those, because I think that might be tied into what the questions that we've been asking, which seem to be, how did the political parties get to the point where they are now and the beliefs that they follow now?
Yeah, so we all as Americans and even many political scientists have the idea that most Americans vote based on economic issues. But that actually has not been true for most of American history. It was true between the 1930s and 1960s, when Franklin Roosevelt started the New Deal policies, and a lot of people were attracted to the Democrats because of their views on economic issues. But before that, and since the 1960s, most Americans actually vote on another basis, usually on ethnicity or race, or religion or region of the country they live in, and to some extent in the last 20 to 30 years based on education level, sex, and age. So what I teach the students is in the New Deal culture from the 1930s, which is when working class voters tended to vote Democrat and wealthy people were Republican. That kind of begins to fall apart in the 1960s, and it's gradually happened since then. And I teach students it's due to 5 sets of issues. One is the military and patriotism, where you had more conservative voters support the Vietnam War. More conservative voters like to fly the American flag outside their home. More conservative voters get upset if football players are kneeling at a football game. More liberal voters did not like the Vietnam War, and while they respect the flag, they don't get as enthusiastic about it. I mean, we've seen Donald Trump at campaign rallies hugging the American flag to show his support for flag lovers. So that issue divides liberals and conservatives, and eventually Republicans and Democrats. Second set of issues that I tell students about is civil rights. So in the 1960s, you of course had Southern white people resisting equal rights for African Americans to the extent possible, while liberals supported it. That was the period when Southern white voters who used to be the solid South and vote Democrat for 100 years after the Civil War, suddenly all en masse became Republican. You have elections today in Alabama and Mississippi where the Republican presidential candidate will win about 90% of the white vote.
Yeah.
While the Democratic candidate will win about 98% of the African American vote. And it's very racially divided. In modern times, you see that with immigration. So you see conservative voters getting very upset about immigrants coming to the country, especially illegal, but even legal immigrants. And you see liberals who are more welcoming of a diversity. I mean, a lot of liberals like the fact that if the people around them speak differently or look differently or act differently, a lot of conservatives get upset by that. And so you see that issue kind of splitting apart the old party coalitions. Third issue I like to discuss with the students is the environment, which becomes a big issue in the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And you have liberals who support, lots of regulations to prevent pollution of the water and the air, also to prevent climate change. Joe Biden supported federal funding for electric vehicle charging stations. You get conservatives who not only want to stick to their gas-powered vehicles in modern times, but in the past, when you have lots of regulations on pollution, that prevents development of land for mining or for agriculture in the West. So you especially get a split in the western part of the United States between those who see the land as something useful for economic development and jobs, and others who see the land as something to preserve the human race and to prevent pollution and things like that. So you get a divide between the parties on those issues. Fourth set of issues I like to discuss with students I call social issues. These are ones that revolve around religion and revolve around sex, meaning as a form of gender. So with religion, you get conservatives in the 1960s who were upset about prayer being taken out of the schools. There's a lot of conservatives today who remain upset about that. I talked to them. I talked to students who were upset about prayers not being in schools. Liberals, on the other hand, said, why on earth would we be praying in school? You get, in a state like Oklahoma, they're now trying to fund a charter school, a Catholic charter school with public funds, which the Supreme Court ruled decades ago was unconstitutional. And then with related issues of women, you had the Equal Rights Amendment, where liberals argued for that and conservatives were against. You have the abortion issue, which divides liberals and conservatives, and you have the many LGBTQ plus issues in modern times where liberals and conservatives differ. I mean, I think for better or for worse, one of the most effective ads Trump ran last year, which may have won him the election, was about Kamala Harris's views on transgender issues. And the ad famously, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact words, but the ad, and it was something run by Trump saying, Trump is for you, she's for they/them. And that hit a lot of more conservative voters where they really, where they get, I don't know why people get agitated, but a lot of conservative voters get agitated about the pronoun issue. And then the fifth set of issues, the final one I'll talk about is crime and law and order, where starting in the 1960s and 1970s, where conservatives saw disorder on the streets and said, let's lock all these people up. And they also argue, we need more guns. We need guns to protect ourselves from criminals. And liberals look at it this way and say, well, the more guns you have, the more crimes there's going to be. There's a very different attitudes toward guns among conservatives and liberals. And liberals would also be more likely to say, well, let's look at the reason people become criminals. Let's analyze the psychology behind the behavior of criminal activity, whereas a conservative would argue, let's just lock them up. So you get these different, and the death penalty, you also get a division between conservatives and liberals. So those five sets of issues I just went over are what I teach to students, are what caused a political realignment in the United States starting in the 1960s that's really continued to the present day. I mean, those five issues are still probably the five key reasons why someone is a conservative today and someone else is a liberal, probably much more than economic issues as we might expect.
Well, it's interesting to me, too, because a lot of the things that Republicans have used to win elections over the last few years, and certainly last year, were those trigger issues. Like you said, the LGBTQ, the crime in the streets. And again, they tied that in very nicely with immigration, saying that all the crimes and violence in the streets were being performed by illegal aliens. So, they dovetailed everything in very nicely. So it does seem like the Republicans have a good idea of what the triggers are and how to pull those triggers, maybe better than the Democrats at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it strikes me, and I've told people this for a while, that for decades, Democrats seem to think that their path to success in the majority is reviving the New Deal coalition of the 1930s from, almost 100 years ago. and and pursue policies that help working class voters. They may be good policies, but politically they're not helping. I mean, Joe Biden spent 4 years in office trying to pursue policies that he thought would provide economic development opportunities and jobs for working class people. And how did they reward the Democrats? As they all voted against him. They all voted against Kamala Harris, the candidate of his party. It doesn't help. I mean, most voters, while there are still some voters out there who will vote based on economic and class issues, probably a majority of voters don't. They vote on some of these non-economic issues I was just discussing, and the Democrats never quite seem to get that. They always seem to think, for better or for worse, some of the policies advocated by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they may be good policies. I'm not judging them in that way, but as far as this idea that if we had full socialist policies, suddenly the New Deal coalition would come back together and voters would be voting Democrat. I mean, to me, that's just a fantasy. I don't. That's not how most people in this country vote. And so I think you're correct, Don, in your assessment that Republicans seem to get that more than Democrats do, and that's helped, Trump win 2 out of the last 3 elections.
We'll return to our podcast in just a minute, but first, this soothing musical interlude.
Dr. Robert Speel earned his PhD from Cornell University and his BA from the University of Pennsylvania.
Penn State University Press published his book, Changing Patterns of Voting in the Northern United States. It's about the creation of the regional divide of red states and blue states.
Dr. Speel is the recipient of the 2008-2009 Council of Fellows Excellence in Outreach Award and the 2006 George W. Atherton Award for Excellence in Teaching.
To find out more about Dr. Robert Speel, visit his website at Behrend, that's BEHREND.PSU.edu/person/Robert-Speel-PhD.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
To what extent does this indicate these things you're talking about? We're talking about the changes in where the parties stand. Do these reflect the changes in where the electorate stands? Like, are there people who are now voting for things who voted for opposite things 20 years ago?
There are some. I mean, people who vote for Trump, there are people who voted Republican for Bush 20 years ago and are now voting for the direct opposite when they vote for Trump 20 years later. So there's some voters who just kind of stick with the party, and they'll be led by the party leaders, whether it's a Bush or a Trump. But there are also some voters who do change their mind about issues. So there are some voters, some people who vote Democrat. 20 years ago they were conservative, but the Republicans did something that offended them. Perhaps they have a family member who's gay. Or transgender, and then the Republican attitudes on those issues offend them, and they suddenly become Democrat. There are people. I'm trying to think. There are people. Bush. The Iraq War was identified with Bush as a kind of Republican issue. I'm sure there are voters out there who perhaps a loved one died in Iraq, and they decide I no longer support this kind of policy being pursued by the Republican Party. They started voting Democrat. Now, Donald Trump does not represent the same foreign policy as Bush, but those people might be voting Democrat ever since then. There are plenty of people. I actually know at least a couple of my former students who, on the transgender issue, that they were kind of moderate, sometimes voting Democrat, sometimes voting Republican. But I'm for you and she's for they them. For whatever reason, that really Don, as you said, it's a trigger. And that gets them upset, and they vote, and so they voted for Trump. So there's some voters who are just kind of being led by the party leader, but there are other voters who their views on issues evolve over time, and they're often the voters whose views evolve over time. It's almost never economic. It's almost always one of these socio-cultural issues I was just discussing. So there's a mix. The short answer, I guess, to your question, John, is it's a mix.
One of the things that we were talking about before we went on, started to record today was something that has occurred to me is John and I have talked to people before about things that have happened in the past. And it seemed like at the end of the Civil War, the Republicans were for emancipation of the slaves and getting them integrated into life, and the Democrats were all Ku Klux Klan members and that sort of thing. You mentioned it earlier, the Solid South, and they always voted Democratic because it was anti-Negro. And by the time I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, that had completely changed. Democrats were behind black people 100%. Black people voted Democrat all the time. Republicans always voted white and that sort of thing. So that sort of sea change between the two parties, are we seeing that again today with this sea change between Republicans and Democrats where the Republican message is creeping into places that used to be Democratic strongholds?
I think it's, Don, I think it's kind of been a gradual change since the 1960s. I'm not sure anything has significantly changed just in the last 10 years or so. I mean, one thing I like to do with my students, and this is, I'll advise some of the listeners that this is a fun thing to look at. Compare the Electoral College map of 1896 to the Electoral College map from 2012. So in 1896, everything that was blue is now red. And in 1896, everything that was then red is now blue. And part of the reason for that flip in every part of the country has to do with those issues I just mentioned. In the South, in particular, the civil rights issue helped cause most Southern whites to move from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party.
It's an interesting point in the sense that you would assume that city dwellers would vote Democratic and rural voters would vote Republican. That seems to be something that has continued over the years. But we did see in the vote for Trump last year, we did start to see things like black males voting for Trump or Hispanics voting for Trump. Now, Hispanic families can be kind of conservative in the long run, but still, it's kind of weird that they would vote for a candidate who, throughout the entire campaign, said, we're going to round up all the Hispanics and kick them out of the country. So that's sort of what I'm talking about. That sort of weird juxtaposition with some of these voters.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things you said there. I mean, that I'd like to address. I mean, you were correct that rural voters tend to be more conservative, vote more Republican, but there were many pockets of rural voters around the United States, especially in agricultural areas, that historically were Democratic until Trump. So you can go to, for instance, you can go to parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin, Iowa, that despite being rural and agricultural had voted Democrat for decades, voted for Obama twice, and voted for Michael Dukakis for president in 1988 when he was running against the first George Bush. And these places have just suddenly gone to Trump. So you get a bigger divide between the urban and rural areas than you had prior to Trump. And to some extent, rural voters just kind of think, I don't know, I don't fully understand it, but they kind of think that Trump is with them. He's with rural people against those urban people. And some of it relates to the issues I discussed about. Among Latino Americans, I think there's a couple things happening that, Trump did better than expected in 2020 among Latino American voters in Florida and Texas as well. And some of that is just the kind of historic opposition of many Latino voters to communism or socialism, which, while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is of Puerto Rican background, and Puerto Ricans historically have been the most democratic of the Latino ethnic groups, Cuban Americans, people whose parents or grandparents immigrated from Cuba, tend to be very, very anti-communist, anti-socialist. And there were advertising being run in social media feeds going to Latino voters in Florida and Texas, which basically accused Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris of being a communist or a socialist, and that's a deadly accusation against a Democratic candidate. In addition, if you look at some of the polling data, and I'm not 100% sure how accurate the polling data is, there seems to be among both Latino voters and African American men, it seems to be also related to educational level. As I was mentioning earlier, I mean, there's now a direct correlation, at least among white voters, between more years of education voting Democratic. That seems to be becoming more of a pattern now among non-white voters. And so among Latino American men, basically those who have university degrees stuck with the Democrat, but those who do not have university degrees were more likely to vote for Trump. And despite his rhetoric, I think there's also this attitude, particularly among male voters, that he's rich and successful. And perhaps that's something that a lot of young male voters would also like to have. And so they see him as a success story and someone to, and they might not be fully aware that his hotels have declared bankruptcy 4 times. But I think there's that attitude that he's wealthy and he's kind of all the things they would like to be. It's aspirational in a way.
That was the word I was waiting for, that this was an aspirational vote. I mean, there are social tensions within the races in the United States and complexities, which led to part of the vote. I mean, there was a reluctance, I think, to vote for a woman of color, and a woman of color who many people saw as a cop. There's just all this very interesting. There'd never been a person quite like this running for the top office in the country. And it seems as though many voters didn't know what to do with it or knew what to do with it, which is not vote for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That was a factor. We don't know for sure because even if you have good pollsters, people lie.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the Tom Bradley effect, right?
People aren't going to say that's not why they're not voting for. I mean, our former president Barack Obama sensed it in a way, and I remember the campaign appearance. I think it was in Pittsburgh during last year's campaign. He was trying to address African American male voters, and he was saying, I know a lot of you aren't feeling Kamala Harris, he said, and he was trying to, in a nice way, say, stop opposing her because she's a woman. Because he was criticizing, and Obama was criticized for criticizing other African American men. But I think that was probably a factor. I mean, maybe not the biggest factor, but enough of a factor to cause her to lose the national popular vote by about 1.5%, which also caused her to lose in the Electoral College, of course. So it's hard to tell, but I mean, my political senses, as do your political senses, kind of indicate that probably was at least one of the factors.
That's so interesting, isn't it? How big is the voting body in the United States? 160 million, whatever it is.
About 160. Yeah,
that number of people, their complexities have changed. Their concerns have changed. I mean, we're looking at, we're not actually looking at the 1920s or the 1890s. We are looking at this particular moment when we used to be one thing and we're another thing.
Yeah, that was my next question to you, Rob, and that is the people who are complaining about Trump constantly on Facebook and everywhere else that you hear about complaints about Trump is that he's dismantling the government. The people who support him say government's bloated, government workers aren't any good. Basically the kind of reasoning that he and Elon Musk are using to fire a lot of them. And they go along with that. They say the government can trim down. There's a lot of bloat. There's a lot of excess. There's a lot of corruption that goes on in government and just get rid of it all. But on the other hand, there are people who are saying he's tearing apart the basis of democracy. He's tearing apart the separation of powers. He's, doing whatever he wants, much like a dictator would. Where do you see us going from here? Is there going to be a correction? Or are we just going to continue to go down the Trump path and everybody's going to let him? Because that seems to be what's happening now. Everybody's just sort of looking the other way and letting him do whatever he wants.
What's interesting, and I'm watching to see. I mean, we'll see if this happens over the next few years. If Trump is supposed to serves a full term as president. We'll see what happens. But I mean, a lot of the cuts, I mean, what most Americans don't realize is, most of the U.S. government budget does not go to foreign aid. It does not go for the Kennedy Center. It does not go for all these other things that Trump is shutting down. I mean, all this combined is probably less than 1% of the national, well, maybe a little more than 1% if you include foreign aid of the national government's budget. I mean, 60% of the budget is just entitlement programs. And entitlement programs are Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And what's interesting, and then another 15 to 20% is defense, and there's interest on the debt. I mean, if you exclude entitlement programs, interest on the debt, and military defense, the rest of the budget combined is about 1/6 of the entire budget. So if you want to make significant budget cuts, you really have to go after the entitlement programs and defense. Now Trump is not going after defense. Instead, his defense secretary has called for increasing it. But on entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which is the government health insurance program for lower income people, but actually includes a lot of senior citizens who can't afford, because Medicare does not cover everything, particularly long-term nursing home care. The people who live in Trump country, Kentucky or Eastern Tennessee or Western Virginia or many parts of Western Pennsylvania, they're the ones most likely to be hurt by that. If you start cutting off programs for lower income senior citizens, and you cut Social Security and you cut Medicare and if you cut Medicaid, you're cutting programs for the people who voted for Trump in the last 3 elections. And I think a lot of his voters actually don't get that. I mean, a lot of his voters think, he's cutting foreign aid. Well, that's nice, but that's not going to amount to anything as far as balancing the budget. If they start cutting Medicaid, which a lot of people in the Appalachian part of the United States, which is prime Trump-based territory, it's where J.D. Vance was originally from. Are people there going to finally figure out that what Trump is calling for when he wants to slash government directly affects them, or are they just going to dismiss it and not understand that there's a connection between Trump's rhetoric and what Trump is doing? And so I guess I'm watching to see what's going to happen over the next few years if these cuts and slashes of government continue.
Yeah. Well, it takes me back to the Tea Party days when we had all those conservatives showing up at town hall meetings and everything. And one guy had that famous sign, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare."
I teach students about that sign. I teach students about that when I talk to them about Medicare.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because one can remember a time when that sign would have ended with the word guns.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and some of what you said today, Robert, is sort of helping fill in the gaps that I've had for a long time. And that is one of the ancillary questions to the question I had about the Democrats and Republicans flipping their appeal, is the fact that Republicans consistently voted for people that wanted to take away their benefits. And I could never figure that out. And now it kind of seems like the benefits stuff doesn't occur to them. They're voting for the people that pull those social triggers. And again, if I'm a politician and I say I want to get rid of waste in government, and I tear out that 1/6, but I don't touch Social Security or Medicare, I'm doing what the people want, but I'm not really affecting the budget that much. So I sort of start to see where this has gone and where it could go in the future.
Yeah, Don, I think your analysis there was correct. Yeah, it's people are largely, well, if you depend on government benefits, voting for Democrat would seem to be in your economic interest compared to Republicans who want to slash those government benefits. But I don't think voters think about that. They're kind of thinking us versus them, and the Democrats are in rural areas, Democrats are the party of big government in the cities, and I don't like that. Forgetting the fact that they get benefits from big government that they depend on to survive. Conversely, you get plenty of well-off, you didn't get this 50 or 60 years ago, but now you get plenty of well-off voters who have money, and the Republicans say, we want to cut your taxes, and Democrats say, we want to raise your taxes. But these wealthy people who economically would benefit from the Republicans cutting their taxes will still vote Democrat because on all these non-economic issues, they identify more closely with Democratic values than they do with Republican values. So you find this happening with both sets of party bases among voters.
It's all scrambled. Yeah. What can I say? And it will probably stay scrambled, I guess, for a few years. And we'll, I don't know, you and I, all three of us may not be around to look back on it and say, what a crazy time that was. But maybe our kids will look back and say, were our parents nuts?
Do you remember when? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, Robert Speel, thanks for coming on and sharing all your information with us. It was
fantastic.
Yeah, very terrific. And it gave me, anyway, some answers to some questions that I'd been kicking around for a while. So thanks very much for coming on and helping us out.
Yeah, thank you both. I had a good time talking with both of you.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.